Good afternoon, and welcome to the OC Forum's The Future of program series. My name is Kate Klimo, and I have the privilege to serve as the new president of OC Forum. During our 30th anniversary year, our plan was to invite leaders and visionaries to share their insights into the future. Then COVID changed the future overnight. Without hesitation, the OC Forum offered our first virtual program on Orange County's response to the coronavirus that reached thousands of viewers who were hungry for information. From then on, the OC Forum board worked tirelessly in serving up virtual programs focusing on the future of the economy, mental health, race relations, transportation, education, esports, affirmative action, philanthropy, and even Orange County itself. Perhaps more than ever, we are reminded of the importance of OC Forum's mission to host civil conversations and propose solutions around complex issues that affect us all. Today, we will introduce you to several visionaries who are shaping the future for people in the county and worldwide. As a nonprofit that has historically relied on contributions from in-person events to help fund its mission, the OC Forum has seen people and institutions in this county step up and offer their support through sponsorship. I would also argue that our amazing and diverse board of directors are among the most engaged on the planet. Now we would simply not be able to carry forth the mission of OC Forum without your contributions. Thank you. To all of our viewers, supporters, and sponsors. While we face one hurdle, roadblock, and pile of lemons after another, we have not forgotten to celebrate each other. We hope you enjoy today's program as we continue to celebrate the 30th anniversary of your OC Forum. Thank you for tuning in, and enjoy the conversation.
At UCI, we believe in the infinitely curious. We believe in the courageous of thought, the ones willing to fail again and again, until one day they don't. When you have the courage to see things differently, to see opportunity where others see impossibility, amazing things will happen. At UCI, we stop at nothing to change the world, to save lives, and deliver the extraordinary.
Good afternoon, and thanks for joining us for the Future of Law Enforcement, presented by UC Irvine and UCI Health. I'm Will Swaim, president of the California Policy Center. I'm also co-host of National Review's Radio Free California podcast. You can find that wherever you find great podcasts. I'll be your moderator for today's discussion, and our first guest up here is going to be the District Attorney for Orange County, Todd Spitzer. Todd, we're here to talk primarily about the sense among many people that there's a real crisis in policing, or at least a crisis of confidence, I guess, if not an actual performance. And you and I are recording this just a few days after the Minneapolis jury found Derek Chauvin, the police officer in the George Floyd case, guilty of actually murdering Floyd. And before we really get into kind of the Orange County context, I'm wondering, you're a pro. You've been in the law enforcement business for decades. What's your perspective on that particular case, the outcome, and how perhaps it actually shapes your vision of the future of law enforcement in Orange County?
Well, you could say, George Floyd, you could say Breonna Taylor, you can say a lot of names of people of color, African Americans in particular, who have lost their lives at the hand of the police. And this is a national conversation. We had civil unrest in the streets. I'm prosecuting individuals on both sides of the political spectrum because of civil unrest that occurred and turned into violence here in Orange County. I'm very unsettled by it. I mean, Will, I've known you for 30 years, and my life goes back to when I was 8 years old and my family lost its business during the civil unrest in East Los Angeles in 1969 during the Vietnam War. And, I became a high school teacher because of that. With respect to the verdict, I was very pleased with the outcome of that verdict. I think the jury was spot on and got it. And when I saw the video, I was sick to my stomach, having been in this profession for so many years, Will. And, he needs to go to prison, and he needs to spend a very, very long time in prison. He killed George Floyd, and the use of force was unspeakable.
Peter Harden, the guy who's announced that he'll run against you, is part of a kind of nationwide movement, certainly one we've seen in California, where progressives have come at policing as if policing's really in need of desperate reform. They are advocates of the idea that there's systemic racism in policing. Some of these guys, George Gascon was in San Francisco, which is now just alive with crime. He's moved down to LA and brought his playbook there. And there's pushback inside the DA's office, inside law enforcement, a sense that a guy like Gascon is really misreading what's going on. Gascon is replaced up in San Francisco by Case Bowden, also part of this movement. And there again, we see crime rising, property crimes, burglary, homelessness spreading. So, I wonder if to some extent the rhetoric that you've offered here already this morning, I'm sorry, rhetoric, I don't mean to discount it, but your perspective is shaped by that awareness that that's out there, that people are really concerned about these issues. And yet, is there a danger perhaps in being pushed too far in the other direction, the Bowden, Gascon, and I would argue perhaps Harden perspective?
Yeah, so that's a lot to take in one, succinct response. Well, you forgot a guy named Krasner in Philadelphia. What they all have in common is they are part of this progressive movement. Krasner was a civil rights attorney who sued police departments, got elected DA when he has to work with the police. Chesa Bowden was a public defender in San Francisco. He got elected DA. And you see George Gascon, and what they all have in common is something that I'm going to hold up. It's not that people can see it, but it's a study that they all cite that says we shouldn't go after misdemeanors or the broken windows crimes, vandalism, trespassing, drunk in public, drunk driving. What they cite this one study to say, if you actually prosecute people for misdemeanors, they're more prone to get involved in the criminal justice system. And I don't believe, and I honestly, think this. I've been doing this for 30 years in this county in various capacities. I don't believe Orange County wants to go the direction of Los Angeles or San Francisco. I went to law school at University of California, Hastings in the city. We call it the city because San Francisco had been one of the most glorious landscapes and places in the world. And I've traveled throughout the world. I mean, I'm infatuated with San Francisco, and it's not a place that people want to visit. In fact, about 60% of the higher income earners in San Francisco have exited that city. And Los Angeles, if you talk with the Irvine company here in Orange County, people are coming away from Los Angeles in droves to get out of Los Angeles. Crime is up in all these cities. But let me talk about what I'm doing, because I think that's what I want to share, is that I'm not a caveman prosecutor. I never have been. I started in the DA's office in 1990 as a line prosecutor. Let me make a distinction. The police and prosecutors are not the same. That is one of the discussions in the politics today that people need to understand, Will. I am responsible for holding police officers accountable. The reason the African community and the communities of color are so frustrated is because they perceive, rightfully so in many instances, that prosecutors do not hold police accountable. They look the other way, that they have too close a relationship. In fact, there's a movement by Chesa Bowden and George Gascon to eliminate campaign contributions to people like me, elected district attorneys, from police unions. They want to shut down the money. Yet they get all their money from George Soros and organizations that are on the left that want to completely dismantle and defund the police. So I'm coming to the job. I started a recidivism reduction unit. I'm diverting people for low-level crimes. I have a mental health unit. I'm trying to deal with the mental illness side of public safety. People who are addicted to drugs, people who are addicted to alcohol. Everybody knows, hopefully people watching this interview, that I was very instrumental in dealing with the homeless. I built the first homeless shelter in Orange County in my district. I said, I'll do it in the 3rd supervisorial district. We built the first mental health crisis center in my district. It opened under Don Wagner, but it started and I agreed to let it be sited in my district. So I have brought to the table, I hope, a whole set of reforms that really try to be empathetic and have a heart dealing with people getting to the system well, but not at the expense of looking the other way at violent and serious offenders who are destroying our community, like those who are doing hate crimes in our community. I'm prosecuting a white supremacist who went after an African American woman who was pregnant at the time and said he was going to drop her baby, and he tried to attack her. He has gone to prison twice before, and he has 7 convictions for hate. He's eligible for 25 to life under 3 strikes, and I'm prosecuting him to the fullest extent of the law. Mr. Gascon, one, said he wasn't going to support enhancements. Hate crimes are enhancements. He had to back off on that. He said he doesn't support 3 strikes. Well, what are you going to do when a man has a swastika etched on his chest and attacks people of color very violently in our community? Hey, Will, I'm not apologetic about it. I don't want that guy to be part of our society.
Okay, so I'm glad you brought up mental illness, because that is a significant feature at play here. There was a story, I think, just perhaps last week, in which a guy in his 30s was throwing rocks at a car being driven by a Korean mother. I think it was a woman of Korean descent and her child. Sounds pretty terrifying for this woman, and yet the guy's explanation to police that Korean people are trying to control him sounds, at least to my amateur ears, I'm not a psychologist, I'm not a policeman, but it does sound like a person who's deeply troubled mentally.
Okay, let me say I completely agree. We've charged that case. Let me give you a contrast in a parallel situation. In Grijalva Park in the city of Orange, a Hispanic man went after an elderly Asian couple who was walking Grijalva Park, pushed them to the ground and battered them. And in a subsequent interview, he indicated that he was going after them because they were Asian. Just a week earlier, he went after an Olympian, an Asian woman who's an Olympian on our Olympic team. She's in karate. She obviously could defend herself. Thank God she didn't have to. But that doesn't mean like what Chesa Bowden wants to do, what George Gascon wants to do, what Peter Harden wants to do, Krasner wants to do. They don't want to prosecute these people. They want to look the other way. What I want to do is bring them into the system because they broke the law. And then I want to come up with a mental health treatment program with the court intervening and having oversight so these people can get help. Will, my cousin Patsy is a paranoid schizophrenic. I lived with her dad when I was in law school. I lived with him in Berkeley when I was getting my master's at Berkeley and my law degree at Hastings. And my cousin Patsy was terribly sick and she refused to take her medication. And she engaged in little petty assaults against people, and she was in trouble all the time. It broke the heart of my family. My uncle was devastated. And at that time, there was just no way to get help for Patsy. She refused to take her meds. So we've got to figure out how to compassionately deal with the mentally ill, but we have to keep them away and from others until they're stabilized because they're out there hurting people. No elderly 70s couple should be pushed down from behind. My God, I mean, this is violence. And I'm not going to look the other way on it.
We've got, in other words, 2 kind of competing interests here. The deep desire, I think, for public safety is universal in humanity. We all want public safety, and this woman should not have to, go through something like that. I think we all agree. The question is, how does somebody in your position have to view this both as a popularly understood attack on an Asian person and simultaneously is simply a straightforward case of apparent mental illness?
Maybe I didn't answer that well. Let me take another stab at it. I apologize. I said that person comes into the system, and then we design with their attorney and the court a mental health program. We have mental health courts. We have veterans courts to deal with veterans who suffer from PTSD and get involved in crime or because they have mental illness or other issues or substance abuse. So my point is we can't ignore it. They need to be brought into the system, and then we try to deal with them compassionately. I have another example. I have a young African-American man named Dante Epps. He came from Virginia by himself, land of plenty, came west, young man, to do well. And he found himself abusing marijuana, and he had a psychotic episode, and he ended up stabbing his roommate. And when the police came, he almost got killed by the police because he went to attack her again in the police's presence. And thank God the police did not use deadly force. Otherwise, we would have had another situation like we're seeing all over the country. I have assigned that case to myself with one of my other prosecutors because I don't want this young man to go to state prison and forever be changed, because I know there's a very strong probability that if an African-American young man goes to prison, when he comes out, the likelihood of success is going to be this big. So I'm working with him, his attorney, not with him, but his attorney, the courts, and my prosecutors to design a program to help him. What I'm trying to tell you is, when I started in this office in 1990, we had more of a caveman mentality. We didn't think about the defendant. We didn't think about an appropriate disposition. We didn't think about how do we help people. What we did was, how long could we lock somebody up and throw away the key? It was really a carceral mass incarceration system. Those days are over. I will not tolerate it. I'm fighting against it. And I've made it very clear we're going to have a much different district attorney's office. And we have. That's why I formed the recidivism reduction unit, and we're forming a mental health unit.
You find yourself a little trapped in terms of freedom of movement and policy between, as you called it, the caveman mentality of the past, and then a guy like Peter Harden or Gascon or Chesa. I'm sorry, thank you for correcting me on that. I've never actually heard it pronounced. I've only been reading it. But you find yourself trapped between these two kinds of, I wouldn't call them polar opposites, but competing claims. One is lock them up and throw away the key. I'm not sure that's exactly right, but you and I were around at a time when investigative reporters at my paper were looking very hard at your predecessor. And then on the other hand, you've got people who think that somebody like you is still too severe and you're too much in the old mold. You find yourself trapped between those two competing perspectives.
I really don't. That's an awesome question. I wish I got asked that question more often, because I don't. I've always been like this. I've always had a very, very strong compassionate side. I think I felt boxed under the earlier model that I was raised by, right? When I started in the DA's office, I couldn't push back. I was a line prosecutor. I did what I was told to do. Now that I'm the elected DA, I get to shape the future of prosecution in Orange County in the vision that I've always had in my heart and my head, which is really hardcore against the violent, terrible people who kill people and sexually assault and rape and child molest and things like that. But the lower level offenders, the first time offenders, those who have mental illness and substance abuse, I really want to be compassionate and help them when we design programs for that. You're going to talk to Sheriff Barnes as part of this series, and I really do appreciate the forum for putting this together. And he wants to get completely out of the business of dealing with the mentally ill. But I agree with him. He shouldn't. When you call 911 for a mental crisis call, it shouldn't be the police that respond. In City of Anaheim, Chief Cisneros has a pilot where he's not dispatching the police, he's dispatching crisis teams to help somebody in crisis. That is the way we should be responding.
Tell us how that would work out or play out in the case of the young man from Virginia with the psychotic break post-weed experience. That seems like a case where people who know how to diffuse a situation could be helpful, certainly mental health workers, but also a very potentially very violent situation where, unfortunately, ultimately some kind of real force might be required. How does it play out in that kind of a scenario?
So in that scenario, when the call comes in, hey, there was his roommate and her mom were locked in their bathroom on an interior bedroom. And the call went out, hey, we're being attacked. This man's been using drugs, things like that. That's not a mental health solo call. That is a dual dispatch with the police, with a crisis team, where the police obviously have got to keep these people safe. But if there's an opportunity to talk to him and use those kinds of techniques, they should be deployed. What happens is when somebody has alcohol or drugs on board, or they suffer from a mental illness, they're not thinking clearly, right? They don't think rationally like you and I. There's things that are affecting their organic ability to process information safely. They're not rational. So, but what happens is the police are either not trained well in those situations, and the person is escalating. Like, we reviewed a terrible situation. A man was having a mental crisis. His parents called the police. Buena Park, I think it was, responded. He walked down the street, wouldn't respond to any commands. He opened up his jacket, which had been closed, and pulled out 2 large knives and came out the police. I mean, people suffer from mental illness. It wasn't handled or treated early enough. And then they found themselves in a situation where they either wanted to assault the police or They wanted the police to put them out of their own misery, like, right? Like suicide by cop. We see this all too often. And it's very, very unfortunate. We've got to do better, which is why I wanted the Mental Health Crisis Center in Orange County to be in my district. And it's on Anita Street in the city of Orange. And there the police are able to bring people to get them treated and seen by mental health experts, hopefully at an early stage of their organic crisis, so that then they can get the help before it results in a situation where they feel they're utterly desperate and have no choice but to be like assault or be killed by the police.
Just to put a slightly finer point on it, can you tell us about the difference between defunding police and what you've described? I mean, I think I understand it, but I want to be really clear. We've got calls all across the country for defunding police, and at least in my sort of very cursory research of it, virtually everywhere where we defund police, we see a spike in crime. Oakland is the most recent example I can think of where we saw reduced police funding and then a spike in really violent crime.
Yeah, so I actually have the data. Police in cities where police activity declined by 48%, murder rose 56% in 10 cities. So Louisville, they stopped doing police stops, right? Car stops, 35%. Their homicides went up 87%. Minneapolis, arrests went down 42%, homicides up 64%. LA, arrests went down 33%, homicides have gone up 51%. In fact, Paul Koretz, who I serve with in the legislature, Hollywood, very liberal city councilman, LA City Council. And I served with him in the state assembly. He just recently ordered Chief Michael Moore in LA to do a report. Why are homicides at the all-time high in decades in Los Angeles? I could answer that question. It's pretty intuitive. So let me get back to your question about defund. It's not about defunding the police. That is a response to a frustration by those who have been or perceived to have been oppressed by the police, thinking that if the cops are going to use all these resources, right, and it's huge in all of our government organizations, then there's no money left for social services to deal with problems before they're created. Martin Luther King said this: government budgets are an indication of where you have your priorities, where you make your investments. And what I'm saying is we need to invest more in our young people, mental illness, and substance abuse. By making marijuana legal in California, we are seeing more people slaughtered on our roads because of the combination of marijuana and driving under the influence, and the combination of other prescription drugs with marijuana and alcohol with marijuana. There are real consequences. I'm not against the legalization of marijuana. I'm against the legalization, or not legalization, the use of marijuana and then driving. And so we have to understand we need to invest in education in our community, but it's not about defunding the police, and it's not about defunding your prosecutors.
What does the future of the DAs look like in this world of kind of countervailing forces? On the one hand, you've got the progressive Tom Steyers and George Soros types funding the Bowdens and the George Gascons, and on the other side, you got people who are saying that you're too tough and you're not tough enough or whatever. Where do you see the future in that office, and why the heck would you stay there?
So let me just tell you, yes, I've had to turn on the fundraising spigot, and it's not coming from unions. It's coming from just $5 at a time through online fundraising. People are stepping up. They get the message very clearly. Well, Orange County does not want to be LA or San Francisco. People didn't come here for that reason. So I think I'm going to have a huge Bernie Sanders type small donor contribution program, and it's going well so far. And I think it's going to continue to be successful. I'm not owned by anybody. I mean, Will, I have been doing this for over 30 years, okay? I'm not in the pocket of anybody. No one's ever argued that I'm a shill for any interest group. In 30 years, I've never lost an election, knock on wood. And I think that's because people understand at the end of the day, yeah, I have controversy. I have issues. Of course I do. I've been doing this a long time. Anybody in my position is going to have issues. I run a huge agency with 900 people and $150 million budget. I'm going to have people who cause issues because we hire people, and people have issues. So I don't hire machines to make judgments about what happens to defendants. The future of law enforcement is phenomenal here in Orange County. We have a completely dedicated chiefs and sheriff who care deeply about the credibility of law enforcement. We've always enjoyed the public trust here in Orange County with law enforcement. I am not going to let that be lost. And so I am really proactively making it abundantly clear that I'm not the police. I'm a lawyer and I'm charged with holding police accountable. But let me make something incredibly clear and close with this. 99.99% of the police officers and sworn personnel in this county and those who support them are phenomenal people. They care deeply about the profession. They want to keep our community safe. All we do, though, is honestly, right? We hear about the horrible, horrible, horrible 0.1% throughout the country, and it's dominating the headlines, and it should, and it's going to dominate for a long time. I'm part of that conversation. I'm proud to be part of that conversation. And most importantly, I'm very proud that I'm leading a national conversation about the role of prosecutors and how we can be tough on the most violent and serious offenders, and yet compassionate and empathetic on individuals who find themselves for the first time in the legal system.
District Attorney Todd Spitzer, a real pleasure. Thank you for making the time.
Thank
I know
you,
you're
Will.
a really busy guy, and you're really generous with your time. Thank you. We'll be talking with several folks like you, as you mentioned, Sheriff Don Barnes, a little later, other community leaders about the future of law enforcement. Todd Spitzer, thank you so much.
Thank you, Will.
The David and Molly Pyatt Foundation proudly supports the work of Easter Seals Southern California. We are the 25%. That's a quarter of all Americans. Over 61 million people with a disability. Our differences make us 100% unique, just like you. 100% creative, passionate, determined, and proud. We are the 25%. And we want a world where everyone is 100% included.
Welcome back to the OC Forum's The Future of Law Enforcement, presented by UC Irvine and UCI Health. Go Anteaters. My name is Will Swaim. I'm president of the California Policy Center. You can find my colleagues and me at californiapolicycenter.org. And I'm also the co-host of National Review's Radio Free California podcast. Find us wherever you find and source fine podcasts. My guest today, this next segment, is Sheriff Don Barnes. If you were with us in the last segment, you heard me talking to District Attorney Todd Spitzer, who finds himself at the kind of the crossroads, if you will, of progressive politics who say that law enforcement has become racist and too violent. And on the other hand, people who look around and fear the decline into civil chaos. A man who knows that well is the next guest. That's Sheriff Don Barnes. Thanks for joining us, Sheriff.
Thank you for having me.
Pleasure. So I wonder, let me start with you, as I did with District Attorney Spitzer, by asking if you and I are talking now just a couple of days after former police officer Derek Chauvin was found guilty of murder in the case of George Floyd. Everybody knows the details. I don't need to go into that. And I'm not really asking you to dissect the prosecution, but just most of us rarely get an opportunity to talk directly to any police officer except in uncomfortable circumstances. And this is one of the first times I've been able to speak to a chief. So I'm really delighted if you'd be willing to share with us your perspective. You see this case from a unique perspective, both as human and American, of course, but also as a police officer of 30 plus years in law enforcement. What'd you make of the case and the outcome?
Well, I think the case, first of all, the incidents that happened in Minneapolis were very disturbing to see. And people should have been disturbed. I can tell you that I may have been or was one of the first law enforcement executives to speak out about what I saw that happened in Minneapolis almost a year ago with George Floyd. That's not a technique that we ever trained for or used. That's the first time I've ever seen anybody claim that was a technique. So that was very disturbing. The criminal justice process and the court hearing process is what it is. I'm not surprised by the verdict. I believe that was a just verdict. I'm a little concerned about the way it was reached, and not that I think it was a wrong verdict. I think procedurally there's some things that bring into question. Alan Dershowitz mentioned it in a recent article about procedurally what he sees as things that might give rise to have the verdict overturned, and then have, of course, a new trial. But that's a totally separate issue. in and of itself. The verdicts themselves, I'm not surprised by. I thought the verdicts were just. And it's unfortunate because when these things happen in law enforcement, we're the only profession, really, quite honestly, in the United States where you can get splashed with pain from the other side of the country, and it sticks on you too because of how we're viewed from the public and the public's trust. So I want to make sure that we have processes in place. We hold our deputies accountable. I don't say that to be grandstanding. I just have an obligation as elected sheriff to make sure we run a just department and that we are meeting the public's expectation of policy and performance measures. And I think that's important to me. I think one area that's probably a misnomer or misunderstanding within the public that we serve, at least here in Orange County, it's brought to me routinely where people say law enforcement never holds themselves accountable. And I can tell you that's not true. In 2019, we had 127 internal affairs cases. I believe it's over 100. And of those cases, 84% of the internal affairs cases we investigated that year were issues or performance that we identified within the organization that we investigated, not brought to us from outside the organization. Put a different way, of all the investigations we conducted, 17 out of 20 is us recognizing or seeing something that we believe needs to be looked at because of some type of performance issue or policy issue that we want to look at. So I'm not trying to grandstand on it. It's just the necessity that we do. We have to be the protector of this profession, and it is a profession, and we want to make sure people conduct themselves in a professional manner. It's the only profession on the planet that you have the legal authority to use lethal force if justified, and we want to make sure all those things are very well contained and controlled. That said, we have trained significantly in recent years on de-escalation techniques and dealing with the mentally ill and other issues as well. It's become an all-encompassing profession, way beyond just delivering public safety services.
Well, that leads to I think a big question here. Are we asking, we Americans, or maybe just people like me, whatever you see here is what you get, but I'm wondering, do we ask you guys to do far too much? The mental illness problem in society, I think, is now really widely recognized in a way perhaps that it wasn't when you and I were much younger men. I think we understand that the motivations of lots of people out there in the world are driven by things that are properly diagnosed as mental illness. And I say this to recognize it's got to be really difficult in your job to manage that, a homeless crisis. We've got immigration issues. COVID-19, of course, is really unique right now, but still, you've had to deal with that. That's had an impact on your ability to run the jails. Can you tell us whether, you sometimes feel like in the call for defund police, you're both being asked to do everything and at the same time being told to make do with fewer resources?
Yes, and you make a lot of great points in that, and I'm not sure I can address all of them off memory because you brought up a lot of issues, but dealing with just everything that falls on the shoulders of law enforcement today that wasn't our responsibility by default just 5, 10, 20 years ago. This profession has changed significantly when I started in the late 80s. If you look at those issues specifically, I was fortunate enough to be a member of the President's Commission on Law Enforcement and the Administration of Justice. And the committee I was speaking on was the social issues impacting law enforcement, is dealing specifically with those three issues: mental illness, substance use disorder, and homelessness. And I want to put this in perspective, especially in the context of the jails that you brought up. This is even outside of the COVID pandemic that happened recently, obviously worldwide, and we're getting beyond that, hopefully, sometime soon. But if you look at the Orange County jail system, before COVID, the pre-COVID population, I had between 1,950 and 2,000 people entrusted to my care on a daily basis that have a daily nexus to mental health treatment. It becomes the de facto mental health hospital for the County of Orange. We had on any given day between 100 and 120 people who are detoxing, medically supervised detoxing off of alcohol and or drugs. And 1 in 5 people booked into my jail are self-declared as being homeless, and they cycle through my jail over and over and over again. So your point is well made, which is simply this: we should not be the first face of government that anybody in any crisis, whether it be substance use disorder, homelessness, or mental health crisis, comes in contact with. The first person they see should not be somebody wearing a badge and a gun. There has to be other intervention strategies built in the system where people intervene, professionals, not law enforcement, intervene much earlier to get people back in either mental health stability, out of crisis, or into sobriety if necessary. And more importantly, for those who are experiencing homelessness, all three of these things sometimes are present: a mental illness, substance use disorders, and homelessness, to get them into a place either through permanent supportive housing or somewhere to get them back on their feet. We have changed the processes in our jail significantly just the last several years to deal with all of those issues, to get people into sobriety, into stability, into housing, into employment. If not for COVID, some of the things we really have been striving to do, which put us behind the curve a little bit, and we will be doing these things coming forward, like vocational training for inmates entrusted to our care, giving skills and connecting them to employment upon release so we break that cycle of recidivism. I think that's most critical. But the defunding the police issue that you brought up is an interesting one, and it's a very, I think, it's a loud voice, a lot of loud voice from a very limited number of people. I think people across the nation realize we have to have public safety services. We need law enforcement to do their job, and our job is really limited. It's not these behavioral health issues. It should be limited to producing safe environments, safe neighborhoods, investigating prevention, crime, and order maintenance issues that we deal with on a regular basis. That's really the three issues that law enforcement is designed to do. We've taken on the mantle on all these other issues because people have not been there to deal with these issues. Defunding the police, I'm going to shock you. I agree with it in concept, but not defunding the police. The issue is not defunding the police. The issue is fund the appropriate intervention strategies that have been absent for decades, so that we are out of the business of dealing with these issues, and the professionals and the trained individuals can't do with that. I have my entire department is trained. Every deputy sheriff receives crisis intervention training, CIT training. Those in the behavioral health units and those professionals, they receive 80 hours of training. They're the highest trained professional law enforcement officers on behavioral health and mental health crisis and intervention strategies, de-escalation techniques to try to get us people into services where appropriate. I have 60 people working in behavioral health in the jails and in the communities we serve. And it's a very large endeavor. And this is not, I did not get 60 deputies added to my allocation of resources. These are people who are retasked off of other jobs to do these things currently that other things are not getting done in the interim. They need to go back to the jobs they're hired and trained to do, not these other issues that have manifested over time.
Can you walk us through an incident that happened last summer? A guy who appears to have been homeless in San Clemente. You might remember this case. The name here, so sorry, looking at my notes.
His name is Reinhold. His last name is Mr. Reinhold, yes.
Yes. The video at the time, it's been a while since I looked at it. I have to prep myself better here, but it seemed that your guys intervened very generously. You had a couple of sheriff's deputies try to talk him in off the street. He was walking through the street. I'll cut to the chase. It ends up with the two officers tussling with the guy on the street. And then he appears to be grabbing for the gun of one of the deputies and is shot to death. You very quickly came out and said, and had your spokespeople out there saying roughly the same thing. This is not how we want these things to end. You have a very careful line to walk there, I would imagine. That is having the backs of your staff who are out there doing the job they're doing, and generally, I would say, more likely than not doing it the way you would want them to do, even acknowledging for the tragic outcome of something like this. Is this an issue of training? Is it inevitable that this is how these things are going to go down until we deal with the homeless and mental illness and even the drug problem that you referenced? Is there some kind of training out of that? Let me back up a second. You said maybe we can make sure that the first people to see someone like that, this Mr. Reinhold, aren't, guys with guns and badges, but somebody else. And yet there your guys were. What could they have done differently, do you imagine?
Well, to that issue specifically, I'm not going to speak because it is being litigated. It is currently being reviewed for criminal culpability on the behalf of the officers and deputies involved. And we also have internal processes that have not completed yet. So I'm not going to speak specifically. I can speak in generalities. Whenever we have these two deputies were assigned to the previously our homeless liaison program, homeless outreach team, and we rebranded that and to be much more inclusive of all the issues being addressed within the community as the Behavioral Health Bureau. Now they're behavioral health deputies, and that includes homelessness, substance use disorder, and mental illness as well. And that same unit exists within our jails also. So we have kind of built that out to be more inclusive of some of the issues that these deputies will be dealing with. I can tell you this, any day when somebody doesn't go home is not a good day. I'm not talking about just deputies. Anybody, when we have an incident that ends in a way that is not a consistent outcome, which is serving the public, is not a good day. And that includes when members of the public doesn't go home. So the outcome that happened with Mr. Reinhold was not obviously the intended outcome. It did manifest into an officer-involved shooting, and that is something that we're still reviewing. I can tell you on a much broader scale of the issues we've been addressing in the public, that these mental health calls that we are changing now, we were including for many years mental health professionals, the behavioral health professionals that are medically trained would go out with us. We're building that system out to be more robust. But a lot of these don't end well. And that's why we need to get out of the business of responding to people in mental health crisis. And we're building the system from the middle backwards, if that makes sense. We have, over time, become the default response, not by design, by default. These incidents or these people commit minor violations of law, or they commit some type of call for service that requires us to be responsive to that criminal element. And then we have to go out and either investigate or respond to it. We need to get people involved on the front end of that so that there's somewhere for them to go and address those issues. The Be-Well campus just opened in the city of Orange is a great example of that strategy. It's part of the integrated services plan that I was deeply involved and worked with the county to put in place. And there's another campus that's being planned in South County now for Be-Well. I'm working with the CEO's office and legislators for funding opportunities to put in place a post-custody reentry facility for those who are being released from jail to have somewhere to go to get sustainable programs connected to services so they don't come back, whether they be mental health based or sobriety classes or whatever that might be. And we've really changed the way we are transitioning people through, with the ultimate goal, quite honestly, getting out of the business of addressing mental health crisis, substance use disorder, and homelessness in a public setting. There's other people who should be making those efforts and bringing those issues to resolution before it becomes part of the criminal justice system.
You know, a lot of people who may be guilty only of nostalgia may believe that things are terrible now and they were great back then. I'm a guy of a certain age, and I can remember the peak in youth violence about the time I turned 17 or 18 in Orange County, late 70s. And of course, the 1960s, you know, we had a president assassinated, a presidential candidate assassinated, Martin Luther King was assassinated. I could go on, you get the picture. Is it your sense, I'm just asking you to kind of pull back the camera for us, is it your sense that things are, as some people say, worse than they've ever been, that America is irretrievably damaged and broken, or that things are getting better, or is it some mix of all these things?
You know, I think this is a point in time where we have to, I think, almost step back and evaluate where we are as a country. And if you look, is there a need for social justice reform? Absolutely. Should it be extreme to one side or the other? No, you have to be tempered in your approach. I think some of the legislative approaches are very extreme, and that's happening on both sides. Some of the positions are, you know, identity politics. If you're this side, you have to believe in absolutely everything. And we're almost taking away the discretion for people to look to be policy focused. And I try to be policy driven. I'm not, this is a nonpartisan office in which I serve. I'm the sheriff for everybody in Orange County. I have to make sure I keep that in mind. It's the one piece of advice I got from retired Sheriff Brad Gates when he whispered in my ear, giving me the last badge I'll ever wear. He said one line, he goes, remember, you're the sheriff for everyone. And I took that to heart, and it's something I firmly believe in. But if you look at where we are today with some of these especially the legislature and how they're legislating their way through this process, the worst piece of legislation you can get is legislation that discards the other half of the stakeholders in the discussion of how the legislation is being crafted, drafted, and ultimately what the outcomes of the legislation or impacts are going to be. Everything we do in government, in fact, everything we do in life, it should be answered with one simple question. What are we hoping to accomplish here? And if it's with a piece of legislation or a policy or something that drives the service delivery within my organization, the Sheriff's Department, that's the question we ask. What are we hoping to accomplish? If this works as intended, what does success look like to us? And then you draft a plan or a policy or protocol to get to that end. but we have to be inclusive of everybody and kind of really be in the middle. I'm a policies issue focused. I have good friends and supporters on both sides of the aisle, if you want to look at it from that perspective. So I want to make sure that I hear other voices when we draft these things. We have a great representation of many stakeholder groups that I've developed relationships with for many years, long before I took the office of the sheriff. I have an interfaith council that represents every faith tradition in Orange County, including the LGBTQ community, that is part of this discussion on where we need to be as a county. I've got members of the Black community I work with, the Latino community that I work with as well. Internally, the department asking the same demographics. Let's take our own first. Are you feel that you're in a safe environment, that you're well respected, you have mutual opportunity for success and advancement? Those are very, very important discussions to have. And then you start working towards the end of being having equality. But there's one thing that is, I think, troubling to me, and I'm not saying this because of the environment we're in. When you're looking at outcomes, you have to look at everybody's involvement and how these things have manifested. And I believe, and this is my observation, and I've had conversations with members of our local AME church and Second Baptist Church and others with group members there. There's also an obligation within the community to be compliant where necessary. We can figure out everything else. I know I'm talking, some people will take this into a historical context of, Jim Crow laws and all these things that happened decades ago. We're dealing with these issues today, and we have to deal with them today, and you have to be honest and be critical in our policy evaluation and the discussion. But if there's this adversarial relationship that keeps manifesting with the community and people keep wanting to push back, we've got to meet in the middle of the room, not yell at each other from the corners, but meet in the middle, have an honest dialogue about what we're hoping to accomplish, and start developing those relationships to turn a corner, or else we're doomed. This country is being forced further and further apart. And now more than ever, we need to come together as one nation, one community, one county, and talk about how we create this opportunity for everybody to be successful, built on mutual respect.
Yeah, you said a moment ago that there are areas of criminal justice that really do need some reform. Just my last question, I hope for your sake, my last question. Can you tell us, if you're the suddenly made king of California and you get to wave a wand, what sorts of immediate things would help law enforcement in the future do a better job, really consolidate public support for your position? It's always going to be difficult in a democracy. We hand you guys a very difficult job in a society that values liberty and free speech. And my own experience is the vast majority of police are just really terrific civil servants. I've just revealed my bias. But tell me, what would you do if you could do anything? What are the 2 or 3 things that you would change immediately and think would have long-lasting effect for people in uniform like you?
Well, that's a pretty loaded question. First of all, I'd be a very big wand, and I probably wouldn't even start in public safety. I'd start in other aspects of public policy in California that is detrimental. But on the public safety issues, one of the things that concerns me most is the perception within the Black community of law enforcement. We have members of our organization, they're great deputy sheriffs and parts of this organization who get it on both ends. They get, they're Black in law enforcement, and they respond to the public, and they get criticized for being Black in law enforcement. I would love to bridge that relationship in a positive way with the Black community and say, this is a noble profession. You want to implement change, you have to do that from the inside. Get people involved in this profession. It's a noble profession. If you're willing to turn a corner, that's how you do that. I don't think that represents, I say the Black community, and that's not all encompassing. There's people within all segments of community that have disparate points of view. One of the other issues I would talk about, here's a great example. If you remember back in the protests that happened last year, our deputies responded to over 60 protests countywide, highly trained, focused on First Amendment rights, first and foremost, great outcomes. But one of the outcomes of the George Floyd incident was this 8 can't wait. If you remember that, these 8 things have to be done. And they brought these lists to me, and I said, not only do I not only agree with you, we're already doing all these things. Some of these, ask the question first, which of these issues need to be addressed locally before you start advertising or telling the public these things need to be done here in Orange County when we were already doing all of them. We've been very progressive in how we have advanced the profession of law enforcement. So, and the other thing I would say is, and I hope this is true, get to know people in law enforcement. We are moms, dads, brothers, sisters, where it's anybody else. I really strive with my staff to get out and meet the public, talk to them, let them know that you're a person just like they are, and then show them the human side of law enforcement as well. So I know that legislatively, some of the things being proposed in the legislature, I'm not opposed to. There were some of the things being proposed in the legislature we've been doing here in Orange County for years that I would be more than happy to support. But some of these legislative items are so they're so separated based on partisan politics that it's hard to, you either have to embrace all of them or oppose all of them, because there's no give or take on how some of these legislative items or bills are being drafted. So I'd say come back first and ask and see what the outcomes are going to be. Unintended consequences are not unintended if you're not asking the questions up front about how these things can be impactful upon the communities. Everybody wants the same thing. It doesn't matter what your sexual orientation is, what your gender is, what your religion is, what your race or ethnicity is. We all want to be safe within our community. We want to be valued members of the community. We want mutual respect within our community. Let's start there and see how we start building towards that end and design programs, protocols, policies, bills, whatever it might be, to make sure everybody's equally appreciated within the community. And that includes the law enforcement profession as well. We're a part of the community in which we serve.
Well, thank you so much for your time. I know you're a very, very busy guy. You're in real demand, so thanks for spending time with us. That's Sheriff Don Barnes, Orange County Sheriff. Stay with us. We'll be right back after a brief message.
In honor of our 30th anniversary celebration of the OC Forum, we are raising $30,000 to establish an endowment fund. Our 30 for 30 fundraising campaign is looking for 30 generous sponsors to donate or pledge $1,000 to this fund. If you wish to contribute, please visit the link in the description below this video. I would also like to thank you for your continued support. These programs would simply not be possible without your contribution. Now please enjoy the rest of the show.
Welcome back to the OC Forum's The Future of Law Enforcement, presented by UC Irvine and UCI Health. My name is Will Swaim. I'm president of the California Policy Center. I'm also the moderator for this conversation. We want to talk first with this really exciting group here, because they sort of answer a problem that has been raised in our conversation with District Attorney Todd Spitzer and with Sheriff Don Barnes. And that question is, what's the public's role in the future of law enforcement? There have been calls for defunding police. We've got problems with homelessness that the police are dealing with mental illness and drug use. We've got immigration issues that have popped up. I think a lot of this seems beyond the capacity of most of us to deal with in our everyday lives. But this group of people here is involved in a unique project that I think may answer some of our desire to get involved locally and help with criminal justice reform in a way that probably makes criminal justice maybe an academic question. That is, that we intervene really early in the lives of our neighbors. So with us today, we've got Senator Josh Newman, representative from District 29, that's North Orange County, LA, and San Bernardino, I believe. I've got all of those. Is that right, Senator?
That is correct, yes.
Terrific. Great. And I've got from the North Orange County Public Safety Task Force, I've got, pardon me, Sue Kang, who's representing that organization. That's primarily what we're going to be talking about here. And then also my new friend, Letty Galley. She's a public nonprofit organizer who works in some communities. She's going to describe for us our work there. But Senator, why don't you start off by telling us what the task force is about? I'm frankly embarrassed to admit I was unaware that it exists. It sounds pretty novel. Can you describe how it was set up and what its purpose is?
Sure, that proves we need to tell our story a little bit better, but it is a good story. So thank you for having all of us, Will. The North Orange County Public Safety Task Force is a 10-city collaborative endeavor to get at the root causes of homelessness, youth gang violence, and post-incarceration reentry in 10 cities in the North Orange County area. The genesis of the project was actually almost exactly 4 years ago today, during my first term in office. And I had a meeting with a bunch of chiefs of police and some city administrators from my district. And they came to me with a fairly non-profound observation, which was these problems, particularly homelessness, are very hard to solve at the municipal level, especially for small cities. And so, they had an idea for a smarter kind of mini regional approach. And so my own observation, sort of coming the other way, was these problems are clearly very hard to solve from the top down, from Sacramento on down, given California's size and complexity. And so I submitted a budget request in the 2017-2018 budget process for the funds that have now funded this program. And it's a really interesting model that as you'll hear, has really sort of interesting implications and potential for replication. But what it does is we have 10 cities that receive funds, and each city receives funds that are split 40-60 between public safety to augment the local police department or sheriff's deputies in their work liaisoning with folks in need. But what it also does, it takes 60% of each city's grant and engages local community-based organizations like Letty's that have expertise and interest in relationships with some of the communities that need serving. And what it has done is it has aligned the efforts of not only the cities across this fairly big area, but also within cities, so that you have chiefs of police and staff who are now working closely with local organizations that they had not prior known each other. And therein lies some real efficiencies and the basis for some progress. One of the most promising features of this whole program is through this process, we have developed a program, an application called Outreach Grid. And that allows, and I think Sue will talk a little bit more about it, but it allows all of the different parties working on these problems to share information, and in so doing, make sure that the people that we're endeavoring to help are properly resourced and guided toward the help that they need.
So it sounds like it's a regional approach rather than just limited to one city. It's not gigantic. That is just something from Sacramento that's an injunction. We must all follow some sort of new model. And it seems to tie together local leaders who are already there, kind of in the community leaders, I'll call them, but as well as elected officials and other public officials. Is that right?
That is correct. And again, that's one of I think the most promising features is there is a ton of expertise and also goodwill that reposited in all these small organizations, and we've tapped that, I think, in an interesting way that actually has produced really solid results in our community, but also, like I said, could serve as a model.
Well, let's talk about what it's like to herd the wild cats of individuals, organizers, public officials, and people with different agendas. Sue, can you tell us, how the groups actually are brought together? They're not required to, I imagine. This is a purely voluntary effort.
It is. And thank you for having us here. So I represent right now the 10 cities that Senator Newman was talking about. And when we got together, we met in Senator Newman's office, his first office, and back in April of 2017. And it was just a discussion similar to this. And out of that came this Budget Act of 2017, where we received funding for the next 4 years. And we are concluding those 4 years at June 30th. It's upcoming. So we're closing the books on it. So we looked at what the region was currently doing. There's a lot of good work that's being done, but it wasn't coordinated. That's key. It was not coordinated. It was not regionalized. There were a lot of efforts that were being done that no one, even a block away, they didn't even know that that was being done. So coordination was key, and cooperation. We received, and your question was, how did you have them cooperate? I think what we saw was that there are these funds that were bringing us together. And so we're going to work together under the parameters of the funding. And so that's how we brought in our community-based organizations like Letty's. I got to know and enjoy what Letty has done in the last 4 years and has seen her growth. So as Senator Newman talked about Outreach Grid, that's a product that we said we need technology to address the enormity of this issue of homelessness. So we scale up. Human outreach is great, technology outreach together. And again, it's bringing these partnerships together that may otherwise have not known that they should be partnering up to address these issues in a much more intentional way. And then also we knew that we had a hard out, June 30th of 2021, which is coming up. And so when we were funding these community-based organizations, we also wanted them to be poised after 4 years to have that, that development, the capacity building workshops that we've done, which is board development, marketing, outreach. We had as mom and pop CBOs to national organizations that were much more sophisticated, and yet they all participated in the capacity building workshops, so that at the end of the 4 years, they were poised to leverage what they've learned, what they've gained, and continue the funding, because we knew funding was going to end. And funding does not equate everything gets great. It's just the experience and the know-how that we sprinkled upon these very good organizations that were doing great work, but just needed a little bit of help and a helping hand. So that's what we tried to do. And I think we were, at the end of this 4 years, I can confidently say that replication of this model is, you could do this. You could do it. If you were able to gather a few people, you could do this. Innovation, I would say, is Outreach Grid, the technology piece of it, the coordination of these community-based organizations, the capacity building workshops that we've done. And then the other thing was that in the beginning, when we were trying to address homelessness, we all asked, what is really going on in our streets? There's lots of opinions, lots of experts, you know, from my mother to my next door neighbors, all kinds of experts in the full spectrum of things. And so nobody really had an idea of what it is that's really going on in the streets. So we launched a 4-week morning, midday, evening homeless census, a by name registry. This is not point in time. This is not a sampling. This is a count. And from the 1,874 people that we counted, 1,324 people gave up their personal information in the hopes that they would receive some type of resource. To date, we have about 600 people from that 1,324 that have been off the streets. This is not a number. These are actual names of people that we can show you. And so why we want to do that was, what's really going on the streets? What are people on the streets telling us that they need? Not what we think they need. And that is, at the end of the 4 years, why are the remaining people, why are they still on the streets? What happened? Is it that we don't have the resources? Is it because they just don't want those resources? What is it? And so we're hoping that we could shed some light on that. So it was information that we wanted, data, good data.
So we'll come back to that, because I really do want to talk about the achievements you've got to show at the end of almost 4 years now. But let's go to Letty if we can, Letty Galley. And how did you? Let's do it in the peculiar Catholic school way that I was taught. What was it like? What happened? And what is it like now for you? What are you doing in the community, and how have things changed for you and under this new program?
Well, thank you again for this opportunity to share really what the task force has brought to Lot 318. It's just been an incredible transformation for us. I'll go back.
And I just want to be clear. Pardon me for interrupting, but Lot 318 is your organization. I ought to have said that. I'm sorry, yes. I didn't. Maybe you can tell us about what that organization is.
Sorry. Yes. So the name of our organization is Lot 318. It stands for Loving Others in Truth. So are you going to be there in the good times and in the hard times? Yes, we will be there with you and for you. We just won't put up with the shenanigans, as we would say, right? We're going to walk you through life, walk with you, and be there for you and with you. So that's kind of who we are. But about 4 years ago, well, a little over 4 years ago, our chief of police, Darren Lenny, called me in and said, hey, think of ways that we can enforce what Lot 318 is already doing, dream big. And so he challenged me to do that. And I'm thinking, okay. So Placentia let me just share a little bit about the past. Placentia is known for 3 rival gangs, right? So we have La Jolla, Atwood, and the Plaza Street gangs. And Lot 318 serves in the La Jolla community of Placentia. The La Jolla community is an at-risk community with limited resources and a large presence of the La Jolla Street Gang, which, by the way, is one of the oldest gangs in North Orange County. Our families are afraid to walk the streets. They definitely don't let their children walk alone. And we serve, Lot 318 serves in the La Jolla community in a cul-de-sac area. And since serving the families for the last 16 years in this cul-de-sac and the surrounding neighborhoods, we have seen the crime rate reduced to a minimal. Now, please understand that this cul-de-sac was once controlled by the La Jolla Street Gang. So you wouldn't go into this cul-de-sac without police escort. It was a very dangerous street. So with our limited funding, we knew that with just a little bit of help, we can achieve so much more. So you can only imagine the task force is exactly what Lot 318 needed to continue the work in the community. So because of the task, I'll share a little bit of things. We've been able to collaborate with other agencies. We've had interns from USC come out with a master's program to help do counseling with our children. The task force has provided, finally, a physical place for us to host multiple events. We now have a resource center where we have parent meetings, weekly group counseling. We have a place for our teens to feel safe, tutoring for our high school students. And that's just a little bit of what we do at our resource center. Having our resource center has been a game changer for Lot 318 because our community now knows they have a place to ask questions, they have a place to get resources, especially this past year during the COVID-19. The task force is very instrumental to Lot 318. We would not be where we are today because without the support of the task force. We are aware that we realize that the areas in where we serve is surrounded by sharks, okay? And if we let down our guards, the sharks will come in and attack and take over. And all the work and changes for the last 16 years will be gone. So we must stand firm in the areas that we're currently in, and we also want to extend it. Our children, our kids are no longer thinking, what gang am I going to join? Sorry.
Wow.
Instead, hold on, I'm not done. Instead, they're saying, which college or trade school am I going to go to? It's huge.
Yeah.
That is. Letty, what's the relationship between your organization and law enforcement explicitly? Like what I see this, if you'll pardon me for just, I'm an outsider, but it sounds like the kind of thing that is more, I would say, crime prevention. Like it really intervenes at a point in the system before people might be so far down that road that it's perhaps too late in some cases.
100%. We realized that at one time, at junior high, you want to reach out to kids, right? But we're realizing we need to reach out to them in elementary school. And so we focus on the family as a unit, okay? We have education for our elementary kids, but when it comes to the law enforcement connection, I have been meeting with the Placentia Police Department for 16 years. You know, I was there when it was, very difficult and dangerous cul-de-sac. And at that time, the Placentia PD was doing community policing on bicycles. And a police officer would say, well, what are you doing here? I'm thinking, well, I'm supposed to be here. I got introduced to this community and I could not sleep at night because of what I witnessed. And I knew something had to be done. And so the police officer like, okay, right, whatever, people come and go. Well, 2 months later, this officer comes by and says, you're still here. I go, yeah, I'm supposed to be here. And she's like, well, we notice there's a difference in the crime rate in this community. How can we partner together? And I'm telling you, probably on a weekly basis, I would meet with the chief of police and talk about what has happened in the community. How can we make it better? What events can we do to provide a place for these kids that are just looking for a place to be accepted and to be seen, right? To be heard, to be loved. Once you can come around that, life changes.
Sue, are there other examples of organizations like Letty's that are doing work perhaps in the same issue? Or you mentioned homelessness earlier. It sounds like Letty, you're more involved in kind of youth assistance, I'll call it for lack of a better word. But do you have other groups like this that are kind of nonprofit organizations that just need a little bit of help and coaching, perhaps a little bit of assistance?
Yes, we have about 48 organizations.
Wow.
And again, youth violence prevention intervention is one focus area. The second focus area is reentry services, and the third is homeless outreach. What was surprising to the chiefs as we started entering into the task force into the years were that they knew about these organizations, but didn't know about the organizations in the way that you just heard from Letty. And the partnership between law enforcement agencies and organizations like Letty's has just been much more strengthened. It's a partnership that isn't just by name, but by action.
Powerful position to be in. So, Senator, you're coming up on the 4-year deadline, I guess, and you're going to have to go back to your colleagues in the State House and make the pitch. I'd like you to think about two things with me, if you would. What would you say? You know, you're in a fairly conservative county. I say fairly. We're more purpley now than we have been. What would you say to people who say, well, you know, this isn't really a role for government. This is something that should be handled voluntarily through churches and families. Maybe you can start with that, and then I have a follow-up on that, if I may.
I think that's a good question. So, I think you had Sheriff Barnes as a guest on one of the other discussions, and you know, clearly these are problems that have defied easy solution for many years. In fact, they've gotten worse, and they also defy, as we've discussed, kind of municipal borders, right? I mean, you know, these are things that, you know, kind of easily bleed over, kind of run across a whole bunch of different cities. And so what we've deliberately tried to do here was to create a framework for developing kind of smarter approaches, and then also for alignment. And Sue has spoken to that, but I will say between Sue Kang and Chief Sainz, and the other chiefs, it has been immensely encouraging. You know, there's a stereotype of the police as kind of, you know, this kind of siloed organization. They do public safety, but not other things. This is proof, I think, that our experience, and Sue has touched on it, and I think Letty as well, that if we can create a better framework and we can better align the community and also our public safety resources within the community, and they're part of our community, you can do so much more with the same amount of money. And so as we get ready to make the case, or I'm already deeply involved in making the case to augment and extend this program, it's been really well received because this model clearly has value. This experience clearly has shown some really positive results. And so not only is it good for our area, but I think it provides a really interesting roadmap for other jurisdictions as well.
Well, one of the things that I like about it is that it goes beyond simple bumper stickers sorts of notions, public policy pronouncements of let's just love each other, or defund the police, or back the badge and be tough on crime. It's fairly nuanced in the approach. Do you think that in this highly politicized environment, not that America has ever been unpoliticized, those of us who study history know this for a fact, it has always been thus. But you're in this particular time when there is a lot of antagonism among at least a small group of very vociferous people. Mm-hmm. I wonder, Senator, if you can address specifically the kind of get tough on crime folks as well as the defund the police people.
Well, you know, and again, I think we've kind of stumbled upon a middle ground here, and I think the proof of that is in the relationships that the 10 different chiefs of police have developed with organizations like Letty's over the last 4 years. And that's truly groundbreaking, right? You know, and I think as folks have mentioned, they were vaguely aware of each other, but they'd never had cause to work with each other. And not only do they now know each other, but they can actually, each of those two sides of the equation can guide the other on, you know, and on better approaches, but probably just importantly, a better understanding of their respective orientations, but their relationships with the community, you know, kind of against their goals.
Thanks, Senator. There's so much more here we could talk about. We got to get the senator on an airplane so that he can get back home.
Thank you.
I want to thank all of you for joining us. It's just been an absolutely wonderful day for me to talk to the district attorney and find out his perspective. We talked to the sheriff about, I think, the tightrope that you got to walk there when you're the sheriff dealing with a multitude of problems that you guys are dealing with in your own organization. So thank you for your work. To the audience out there, I hope you found the conversations today valuable. I think especially meeting this last group of people shows us there's a way for all of us, we ordinary citizens who aren't in public office, who aren't in a police department somewhere. We ordinary citizens who might have something to give. I think Letty offers us some inspiration for that. We don't have to do it full time, I think, Letty, is that correct? We could come by and we can volunteer.
Correct. 100%.
Yeah. So thank you guys for that. I want to also thank the OC Forum for inviting me to moderate this conversation, for setting this whole thing up, for UCI and for UCI Health for sponsoring it. Thanks also to the participants, of course, not just these guys, but the district attorney, Todd Spitzer, and Sheriff Don Barnes. And thanks most of all to you, of course, for paying attention and being in this conversation with us. All the best, stay safe, and love your neighbors.